didn't get any of that. So Christina is going to be here to share a little bit about that with us today. So Christina, thank you for being here, and it's good to virtually see you.
Thanks for having me, everyone. You're Matt, correct? It just says activity on your screen.
Matt, I am the activity.
Got it. Hi. I'm Christina Taylor. I'm the CEO of the Early Childhood Council of Larimer County. And Matt asked me here after, I think, hearing about what we're doing in another meeting, and just asked if I could come share it with you all. So happy to present. I'll just walk you through the process that we followed locally and kind of where we landed. So if you have questions in the meantime, feel free to interrupt me, or you can ask at the end. Let me see if I can navigate there we go. So yeah, I'm going to give you an overview of the work, the recommendations that came out of the work that we've done, and then I repurposed this from another presentation. So I'm not going to give you opportunities to support unless you all want to come up here and help us run a campaign in Larimer. So first off, why did we look at local dedicated funding stream? I'm sure this is not new to any of you, but obviously we suffer from a patchwork and fractured and siloed funding today from federal, state, and local funding. So we currently invest about 13 to 15 million locally in Larimer County between CCAP, CPP, Head Start, sliding scales, scholarships across the early care and education sector, and are falling short significantly when it comes to licensed quality spots for children in our community. Our estimate is about 25% spots for infant and toddler care are available versus the 75% of kids that don't have access. And then we have about 65% of the spots needed in, beyond infant and toddler care up until preschool. So falling significantly short still. One of the anecdotal pieces of information I like to share is that we work closely with a lot of our licensed care providers in Larimer County. And one recently shared with me that they have hired 48 additional or new staff members in the last calendar year and have already lost 45 of them. So the recruitment and retention piece of the early care and education sector is in a dire straits right now as well, exacerbated by the pandemic and just the workforce crisis we're seeing as a whole in the country. Local dedicated funding enables us to have a sustainable long-term approach to fixing the ECE system, and that's why we are looking into that locally. So who did this? This was convened by our organization in partnership with United Way of Larimer County and their CEO, Deirdre Sullivan. We convened a 17-member steering committee that was composed of experts in early care and education, local government, including city council members, county commissioners, business leaders, including our CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, education and nonprofit leaders, just to ensure we had a really wide swath of the county giving us feedback on this initiative. We've convened from January through June with our consultants and our steering committee. I'd say one of the biggest successes of that last 6 months were the consultants that we hired. I decided not to attempt to fumble through this on my own as someone that's never ran a campaign or solicited public funding in the past. And we hired Cody Belsley and Lene Hansen, who are known for their ECE policy work statewide. They were masterminds behind Prop EE and many of the other ECE subsidization proposals across the state. So we've been incredibly lucky to engage those women in this process, and they've led us through an incredible steering committee process. So what did we do? We did a lot. First, we dug into case studies, and we actually ended up looking at 8 other communities that offer local dedicated funding streams to determine best practices, what was working, what was not working, how they got there. This includes Summit County and San Miguel County here in Colorado that both have dedicated tax funding streams for early care and education access. Both of those partner with their Early Childhood Council to ensure expertise in the community in administering that funding. We also studied Larimer County tax measures over the last 8 years to better understand our local voters and what might be palatable to our local voters. We considered 3 possible revenue sources. So we looked at marijuana tax, we looked at property tax, and we looked at sales tax. It was determined very early in the process that marijuana tax would not generate enough revenue to have a worthwhile impact on our community. The tax level on marijuana locally is already very high. Property taxes was considered completely unviable by our voter base in public polling. It tanked and so was quickly removed from our potential revenue sources as well. And then we also looked at 0.115% and 0.25% sales tax. And voter polling indicated that either one of those is viable. So our recommendation ended up on a higher level. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. We undertook cost modeling with Brodsky Research, which was really an attempt to break down the potential subsidies or revenue that we would receive and how that could have an impact on our community. It helped us determine the funding, quote unquote, buckets that we would look at if we were able to pass tax funding locally. We went through 3 different rigorous cost modeling processes to ensure that we had a very clear picture of what it is we hope to fund and how far that money would go. And then we also executed a 3-part public opinion research process. So this included qual boards, which are online focus groups, which we chose to do given that we're in a pandemic rather than in-person focus groups, as well as public polling. So we did statistically significant public polling of 400 plus Larimer County voters based on those who were most likely to show up to the ballot in November of 2021. And for this particular portion, we engaged Strategies 360, who is a national public opinion and polling firm. The recommendations of the group, they landed on our June 11th meeting to recommend a referral to the ballot in November of this year. We did not gather signatures for a traditional community-led ballot initiative, again, because we're in a pandemic and it's not necessarily safe to do it the traditional way. And the non-traditional ways are incredibly expensive. It would have been cost prohibitive for us to do that. And so we recommended formally to our commissioners that they refer, since they have that power as elected officials. The recommendation was that we increase the countywide sales and use tax by 0.25% or 25 cents on a $100 purchase, which I think I mentioned would bring in an estimated $17 million a year. The 4 buckets that we talked about are as shown here. So we've talked about where we settled on subsidizing the cost of childcare and preschool programs for children birth to age 5 for all families based on a sliding scale, so that it would be worthwhile for all families in our community, not just the lowest income. We wanted to make sure we were filling the gaps that CCAP leaves and reaching those families that live above certain income thresholds but still struggle to pay for childcare. That we anticipate will be about half of the overall 17 million that will go to tuition subsidies. For the rest, another large chunk would be investing in the early childhood system to expand capacity and improve quality. We like to call that physical and human capital. So that would include capital investments in buildings and play spaces and classroom supplies. It would include an expansion of our existing quality improvement work that we offer as an early childhood council. And it would include salary subsidization for ECE providers that are making below a living wage. We know that locally in Larimer County, providers are getting paid between $13 and $15 an hour, which is probably what's contributing to that retention issue I mentioned at the beginning. We also committed to a thorough evaluation to measure the impact of the program and putting a reasonable cap in place for administrative expenses. The committee also recommended a 20-year sunset provision. They chose 20 years based on the life cycle of a child, gave us the opportunity to measure our impact from birth to high school to see really how we had an impact on high school graduation rates, how we can have an impact on 3rd grade reading scores, and et cetera. So really wanted to give this proposal enough time to have a tangible, lasting impact in our community. With a 20-year sunset, we would have to it would expire in 20 years or we would go back to the voters and renew at that point. The committee also recommended that the county partner with the Early Childhood Council of Larimer County to administer, manage, and advise on the distribution of funding. And this was largely because we have the infrastructure in place and we have the expertise in place to scale up and implement a huge amount of work in our community fairly quickly. The recommendation to the commissioners also included, sorry, this is in the way, it doesn't matter, also included that the funding should be regularly audited and subject to typical transparency and accountability measures. Any questions on this one before I move on? So, oh, go ahead.
Christina, before you go on, how long did that process take you to get to the point where you could go to the commissioners and make a recommendation to them?
We started in January of this year. So we were on an accelerated timeline. This does take other communities, or can take other communities 1, even 2 years. We felt, given the intense amount of focus that is on early care and education access right now, both locally and nationally, that we didn't want to waste that momentum and that free press. There's a newspaper article every single day. I feel like we didn't want to waste that momentum, and so we pushed to get through this.
Thank you.
Christina,
Question?
how did you, or how are you taking into consideration community-based childcare, home-based childcare? How are they fitting into this?
Oh, they absolutely fit in. And that's actually why part of the rationale between recommending that the Early Childhood Council be the administrator of funding rather than the county, because it allows us to be more responsive and flexible in terms of how we support providers. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't put a quality level requirement. We'd love to be able to support FFN providers with quality improvements and salary subsidies and whatever else we could to improve the quality of care in those environments as well. Whereas we know that, if it's administered through the county structure, there would have to be more restrictions in place just based on how government structures work.
Okay, great. Do you know what % of your childcare in the county is home-based as opposed to center-based?
Licensed family child care providers, they're about 1/3 of overall offerings in our community, maybe just over 1/3. In terms of FFN, we don't have a good read on exactly how many of those providers exist.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming, Christina, in the first bullet there under subsidized childcare, that's for all of those programs that you just mentioned. Licensed
Correct.
providers, home providers, school district, FFN, anybody providing care for children birth to 5. Licensed and unlicensed, is that right?
Ideally, yes. I think the exact specifics would be fleshed out during the implementation phase, but ideally it would be as wide as possible while having enough of an impact.
Christina, do you envision the council contracting with the county collecting the tax, and then
Correct.
contracting a lump sum of money or for a program of work that you lay out, contracting that to the council?
Yes, that's how we envision it, and we're still working through the specifics of that. I can say that's provided some hesitation to our Board of County Commissioners because that's not a typical model.
So the commissioners are the governing body.
Correct.
And you're their contractor.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So where we are now, we've shared these recommendations with our county commissioners and our county manager. The commissioners are currently deliberating. We've had several one-on-one meetings with all 3 of our county commissioners to address questions and concerns. Our county manager has needed a great deal of additional information just to ensure that she understands the legality of some of these proposals and how it would work within the county structure. And our deadline for referral locally for a ballot question on this year's ballot is September 3rd. So we're obviously getting very close to that. I can tell you that I'll be speaking at a public meeting tomorrow for public comment, and we probably have 4 or 5 other advocates that are showing up to remind our county commissioners that we asked them to do this as their taxpayers and constituents. And then we have a public work session with our county commissioners on August 18th to really dig in one-on-one with all 3 to get their questions answered and hopefully come to a solution on how we get this moving forward. If referred, we'll create a campaign committee and move forward to get the election or the campaign running and get folks out to the ballot. What we learned during our public polling process is that we don't have to change hearts and minds with a campaign. Our community is already very well informed about the early care and education needs. Polling showed us that extra education doesn't really move voters. And so what we'll be doing if we get referred is a get out the vote campaign, just ensuring that our base shows up to the ballot.
In the polling, how close did it come to 60% in favor of, or?
We were over 16%.
You were over 60%? Wow.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are very lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Fort Collins in particular was over 70%. That's a very progressive community. And then some of our more rural areas were a little bit lower, but overall over 60%.
Christina, could you comment on how you funded all of these activities up to this point, including the funding and the people that you came in to advise you and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not been cheap, but again, I can't stress enough how important it's been for us to have experts guide us through this process. So honestly, I'll be super candid with you. It cost us about $130,000 for those 3 contractors that I mentioned. So our consultants, the cost modeler, and the public opinion research firm. And we paid for that through a variety of funding sources. The Early Childhood Council pitched in about $50,000 that we had from an anonymous donor that gave us unrestricted funding. So that came straight out of our coffers. And then we had a county Department of Health partner that justified this policy research work under a Communities That Care grant. And so we were able to get a large chunk of funding from our Department of Health to cover some of this. And then we also got some support from Early Milestones through an Early Childhood Workforce Innovation grant. So we patched it together, but we were able to cover the entire cost thus far. And I can say that our campaign consultants anticipated would cost us about $250,000, which is pretty cheap given a campaign normally would be about $500,000 or more. And it's because it's a Get Out the Vote campaign, not a Changing Hearts and Minds campaign. And we already have soft fundraising commitments for $200,000 of that locally. So we're pretty close to meeting the mark.
And that 130, does that include your data collection? You were talking about some of the gaps and shortages earlier. Where did you get that data from? Did you come into this campaign knowing that, or was a part of this campaign getting that data to talk about your shortfalls and your gaps?
So that's part of the role that we play as an early childhood council in our communities. We regularly track local data on supply and demand and access. And so a lot of the data that we used came from what we collect annually. We also have launched a local childcare referral portal in Larimer County called Larimer Childcare Connect that allows families to access childcare free in real time. And that gave us a lot of real-time data about programs that were open, their capacity, et cetera. So the majority of the data collection came from us as a council, but then our government partners provided data, and then the cost modeler did some digging on his own in terms of getting demographic data and those kind of things.
Just one more question on the politics of this. How did Loveland poll in your polling in terms of their response?
We were over the majority. I'm not allowed to share. I was asked not to share specific polling data, but they were over 50%, which actually surprised us in terms of Loveland being a more conservative community. They also recognize this as an issue. Even our, even more rural communities like Red Feather Lakes and Berthoud and Estes Park, the majority of those were polling over 50%.
Other questions, comments?
Well, unless there's more information to share about process.
Nope, that's all I've got.
So the answer to the question, we'll judge this effort successful if, or successful when. Fill in those blanks, whether it's the if or the when.
Yeah.
I know it's 20 years, but in that 20 years, you'll be able to persuade 20 years from now, voters in Larimer County to renew this, because you're going to present what? What kind of data would you expect to present?
I would expect to present that we have licensed quality childcare spots for at least 75% of families that need it in our community, and that we do not continue to have that dire recruitment and retention issue, that we've got providers that are coming into the field, staying in their positions for 10, 15, 20 years. That's success in this system.
Thanks.
I gotta go where I have charging.
Comments, questions?
Only that this is really, really helpful.
It's super helpful.
God, I'm impressed with the work you've done and appreciate what you've done. And it's really helpful for us in terms of our thinking. So,
Yeah, I can tell you that part through our early childhood workforce innovation grant with early milestones, one of the end products that we hope to distribute is a lessons learned sort of roadmap for similar communities to really lay out what we might have done wrong, where we could have done better, and what was really successful, because we really wanted to create a model that could be replicated by similar communities. I can say one of the most important lessons we've learned so far is that partnership is absolutely crucial. We have incredible partnerships with local government here in Larimer County. Our business sector was key in making these decisions and making sure that we had the buy-in of the rest of our community. We've got foundational partners that have been just integral in all of it. And then obviously as the Early Childhood Council playing the lead, I think that worked really well for us given our expertise and our connections at the state level. We've also leaned heavily on partners like the Children's Campaign to give us guidance and TA on what we need to do and how to do it well. And that's been incredible, just to make sure that we don't fumble, because again, this is not my area of expertise. And so it's been crucial to have the experts lead us through the process.
Christina, could you comment on what you've done over the last few years to get your business community in sync with this problem?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's been more than a couple years. We've had a partnership with our local chambers of commerce for probably 5 or 6 years, in which we engaged in a process called the Talent 2.0 initiative. And it really brought together our 3 large chambers of commerce, business leaders, government leaders, nonprofit leaders, to dig in on what issues our community was facing in terms of our long-term economic prosperity. And through that process and through having our early care and education sector involved, ECE rose to the top and actually got its own subcommittee in the Talent 2.0 initiative, and recommendations from that business leader group to focus on childcare to support that issue, because they recognize its impact on the economic growth of our community. Larimer County has been just exploding over the last decade, and the ECE sector has not kept up, as I'm sure you guys are aware, because it's not keeping up anywhere. And a lot of our employers have seen that as a recruitment issue for them. They can't get younger employers with the newer qualifications without also having childcare access for those people. And so it was a long process that took a lot of partnership and community building and relationship building with our business sector, but I think they've certainly come quite a long way in recognizing that this is one of the key factors in their success as well. And I can't take most of the credit for that. That was my predecessor, Bev Thurber, who really engaged our community in a great way.
And so Christina, if we're Boulder County and we're looking at doing a ballot initiative in the next 1 to 3 years, what are some of the key things that you think should be our starting points? Is it focus on partnerships? Is it focusing on funders? Is it focusing on, we got to try to contract with the same experts you contracted with? What should be our areas of focus if we want to look at similar ballot initiative in the next 1 to 3 years?
I would say relationships and partners is the only way we made it through as quickly as we did. I have, for instance, government partners. I have a member of the Larimer County Department of Health and Environment on my board of directors. And when I went to them to say, this is where we're at in terms of needing to raise money for this initial policy research, she immediately went to her boss and said, okay, how do we give them money? If I hadn't had those partnerships to help pay for the consultation process, but also to back us up in the community and to talk this up in other community meetings and to be in our court when it came to saying this is the issue that we need to focus on now because it will have the most impact. So I would say the partnerships and the relationships is huge. I think it's crucial to involve early childhood councils given the connections that we have at the state level and the fact that our fingers are on the pulse of all of the ECE activity coming down from the state. So yeah, I'd say focus there. Finding the money isn't as hard when you've got the relationships, I would say. I didn't find it incredibly difficult to pay for this process because we had so many our partners that were willing to step up to the plate. The other thing I'd say made us really successful is our community was already aware. This wasn't an out of left field issue when we took it to the polls. Our community gets it. And that was many years of public education and community building and community engagement to really elevate this as an issue. Daphne, do you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick, you mentioned early on that you estimated that 30% of all your childcare providers are licensed.
30% are home providers.
Oh, okay.
So out of all of our licensed providers, 30% were home providers.
Oh, I see. Okay. And like you said, I was curious about how, if you had to take a guess of any sort in terms of unlicensed childcare providers in Larimer County, how would you put that pulse? Would it double the number of total providers?
Probably. Yeah, I at least increase it by 50%. I think, for instance, I have a staff member that just had a foster infant placed in her care. And because of the lack of access in our community, she's using an FFN provider rather than go licensed, even though, you know, she's as well connected as one can be in the ECE world. I think that just illuminates how many families have to rely on friend, family, neighbor networks because licensed care is not available. So for us to quantify, I couldn't guess, but there's a significant amount.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And you think, Christina, from this ballot initiative, you'll be able to crack some of that nut of being able to have FFN providers access these funds? Because that's been a big barrier, right? With a lot of federal funding, is that we leave our FFN community out. And you think this ballot initiative, because it's administered through, what do you call yourself? An independent 501c3 as an early childhood council, rather than a government contracted agency, that you'll be able to maybe be more successful than some of our statewide initiatives, which really, with good intentions, left out some of our folks who are providing critical care?
Yeah, it's our hope to be able to do that. I think we have to be very, very careful that we're providing support to legally exempt providers and not, you know, providers that are offering care in their homes for far more children than they're legally allowed to provide. Because, you know, we don't want to be putting money into systems that put children in an unsafe position. That being said, it is an equity issue in our community. We know that our immigrant community, our Spanish speaking community, even our community of color are hesitant to become licensed because of distrust in the licensing system, distrust in our local government. And so for us, it's a crucial part of the strategy to be able to support non-traditional providers that don't want to go through the licensing process. Again, as long as they're doing so in a legally safe way.
I'm assuming you're going to create some measure of quality or some measure of
ideally, yes. But again,
to be able to participate in this system.
Yeah, and how we do our work here locally is really community driven. So we would anticipate that being designed by a community coalition, you know, populated by folks that are offering FFN care and that have distrust in the system as it exists now, so that we are being responsive to our community's needs. And so I can't tell you exactly what that would look like, because that wouldn't be on me to design.
Or for members of our coalition, that is one of our objectives, right, in our current plan, absent the resources you're talking about, but to create that it sounds like very comparable, if not identical, kind of an approach here, right, to ensure high levels of quality without having people to commit to the state licensing system and in all of the implications that go along with that. Can I ask one other, maybe it's not the last, another question relative to funding? You ended up with a 0.25% added to the sales tax to get you the $17 million a year. Was that number based on what you thought the costs were going to be to accomplish what you want to accomplish, or what you thought you could sell, or, you know, the voters would support, and then you'll figure out how to make the best use of that $17 million?
A little bit of both. I think you were looking at potential revenue streams to start with. We nixed a marijuana tax immediately because we knew that it wouldn't bring up in enough funding to have even a little bit of impact. And that was because it was in the lower single digit millions. And so that's just not enough, knowing that we already invest about 13 to 15 million locally. So having a good picture of local subsidization and how much money your community is already putting into ECE was crucial for us, because it allowed us we already had a quantifiable objective. We already knew how many families we could support with X number of dollars, how many providers we were supporting. And so this gave us a picture of, well, if we doubled it, then we're able to double our impact. So it was both. I think because we pulled two different kinds of sales tax as well, and it was both were amenable to to our voters, we went with the higher one so we could have more impact.
So the follow-on question, you heard Matt lay out our both our vision and our intent, right? Or our mission for this effort is to have 100% every child in Boulder County in an evidence-based, high-quality, accessible, affordable program every day. What I heard you say was that your target was 75% in a high-quality setting every day. Just off the top of your head, what would it take above $17 million to approximate 90% or 95%?
So we actually looked at that in our cost modeling to provide 100% of the children in our communities that needed licensed care. So both parents in the workforce, or all parents, if it's a single parent family. It would cost our community a total of $59 million. So if we're talking, we already invested about 15, we're putting another 17 million, that's getting us halfway. So I'm being ambitious when I say 75%. I think I'm ambitious as a nonprofit director who is good at being very efficient with our money. Part of the reason I didn't say 100% is because not 100% of families, even with both parents in the workforce, need licensed care. Many families prefer to rely on grandparents or aunts and uncles or other family members. And so for us, as a realistic target, we're looking at how many families would like to access quality licensed childcare. And of course, we don't have, quantifiable data to how many families exactly want that care. We're using demographic data and working data and all that, but that's kind of where we landed.
Christina, could I ask a question about the importance of the data in terms of talking with your community or getting their support? We've spent quite a bit of time trying to get our arms around, how many kids there were and how many providers and how many FFNs and licensed and, that whole group of things. In the end, when you talk to people about it, how focused are they on the data itself versus them just saying, hey, I get it that this is an issue in our community and I'm okay. I believe that you've got data versus I want to see every little person accounted for and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, even the data that we present is often estimates because again, we're using demographer data. We're using as up-to-date data as we have on licensed care. But I can tell you that one of the most impactful slides we've used in presentations and in conversations with the community is that slide that shows us how many licensed spots we have versus demand and the gap between it. That is very eye-opening to people that don't have children. Someone that's running a business and trying to hire and doesn't realize that that's the reason they can't hire, so-and-so. So I would say that one in particular, the licensed capacity versus demand for care is incredibly important. And the demand for care is not nearly as difficult to estimate if you're using, your county's demography data and the percentage of working parents, which I think you can get from the kids count data every year. It's just a simple calculation. It's not 100% accurate. We're not polling people individually, but it's an approximate number that works for the community to say, this is how many licensed spots we have. This is how many children under 5 have both or all parents in the workforce. So I'd say that one's been most important. Other data, not as much. I think our county commissioners obviously want to know where we would spend the money and what kind of impact that would be. So that was important once we got to the place to, this is how much money we can bring in and let's model it out. I can say in public polling, the message that resonated with everyone is that if we give children access to 0 to 5 quality education, we're improving our long-term outcomes as a whole. So those kids are going to graduate, they're going to interact with the criminal justice system less, they're going to have better mental health outcomes, et cetera. People care about our kids, they want to see them succeed. And so that talking point always resonates really, really well.
Thank you.
Christina, thank you for being here. Rebecca Vlashine from CU Denver. And I have a question for you around the levers that you are most trying to impact through the Milestones Grant. I think compensation was one of yours. And I'm curious to hear how you're elevating compensation in the conversation in your community.
So that's a big part of that human capital investment that we're angling for, is really recognizing that we can't offer quality care if we're not paying providers a living wage. That's really been the key message that resonates with the community. Between that and information on the fact that we have well-respected providers that cannot for the life of them retain employees, largely because they can't afford to live here. The cost of living in Fort Collins is also, or in Larimer County, is pretty high, and it continues to rise. The housing market, as you all know, is just bonkers in Colorado. And so there's another one where it's, how can we possibly expect this individual to educate our children in the 0 to 5 range if they can't afford to live here? We're going to make them drive 2 hours from another community, and they're not going to stay. So that's the biggest talking point we've used. I hope that answered your question in terms of the compensation lever.
Yeah, it does. And I'm wondering if you have any movement yet in terms of your provider partners and how that would actually translate in implementation.
Yeah, so we've definitely used the lessons from partners like the Early Childhood Council in San Miguel County, who offers salary subsidies to providers based on tax funding. And it would be a community informed process. So ideally we pass a ballot measure in November, and we spend 6 months really digging deep with our community to see what would work best for them. But what we've heard so far from other partner communities is that like biannual or quarterly salary subsidy grants or checks to a provider that they're looking forward to helps increase retention. So they'll get paid what they're getting paid by their provider, but if they stay, 3 months from now, you'll get a check, and then 3 more months, you'll get another check to increase their salary overall through the year. And so I imagine that's where we'll land. But again, we would want our provider community to sign off on that before we implemented it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you're talking about the
No,
council.
one of my staff members who adores you. So I'll touch base on that at some other point. Heather Blanco, right?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
No, Christina, so you were saying in the implementation piece, again, the administration part of this is done through the council in terms of what you just talked about, how the implementation of this would be done from the council in partnership with the providers.
Yeah, that's how I, as the CEO of the Early Childhood Council, would like to see it go. Again, I can't speak to how it will fall out if we make it to the ballot, and how the commissioners will honor the recommendations of our steering committee in terms of administration. But yes, if we are given the opportunity to contract with the county to administer, our biggest priority would be ensuring community input and how we do our work. Because again, we see all the time work come down from the state that didn't include community input, and it fails to meet the mark. And we don't want this effort to be another one of those that falls short of what the community really needs.
Christina, do you have a probability of likely approval by your commissioners?
God, I wish I had a good answer for you there. No, they're being a little cagey. I think we've heard from a couple that they really want to refer, but there's a desire for unity amongst our 3 county commissioners, and we've still got one that's in the no camp.
Do you have are there any other ballot questions likely to end up on the November ballot?
No, not
competing.
revenue measures.
That's what you're trying to get at, right, Tim?
Yeah. And are there other elected officials from the municipalities in Larimer County who are weighing in on this on your behalf or on behalf of the proposal?
Yeah, we're working to get those folks to begin to voice their approval. We've definitely heard it behind the scenes. And that's going to be key, because that's one of our county commissioners' hesitations, especially with the sales tax, which is generally reserved for municipalities.
Yeah.
An unspoken rule. But because our county has dumped so much resources into this, so the city of Fort Collins dumps hundreds of thousands of dollars into childcare access every year, and Loveland puts money into early childhood access, and Estes Park is just bleeding money when it comes to trying to build up the system. It's an easier argument to make for us right now than it might be, in a few years from now.
Yeah.
Christine, as it sounds like, and you can correct my comment if it's incorrect, but it sounds like those ballot initiatives that did pass across the state, I'm trying to think in my head, almost all of them had what I'm going to call third-party administrators to really administrate the funds. Is that a helpful target?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly sharing that out. Like for instance, the Denver Preschool Program is a nonprofit that administers city and county tax dollars, and they're held accountable to the city of Denver. But that's been a very successful model because it's implemented by a 501c3 that can be far more responsive to the community need. Same with what's going on in San Miguel and Summit County. Both are partnered with their Early Childhood Council. So yeah, there's definitely precedent to what our steering committee recommended. We just know that sometimes it's hard to try new things, and that's not something we've done locally. So we're going to continue to push that we don't stick with the status quo.
Other thoughts, comments? While we still have Christina here. Christina, I really appreciate you being here. This is super helpful. We've struggled with, so what do we do now? And so this is just really helpful to see how in 6 months' time you've taken an initiative, gotten verifiable data, and created at least a plan that's presented to a municipality or the commissioner. So I really commend you on your timeline, your efficiency.
Yeah, bravo.
We don't like to mess around here in Larimer, so we stuck in with it and figured it out as we went.
Anybody else have thoughts, comments for Christina? I know there's a couple of new members that I don't recognize in the group, so I wanted to give you all an opportunity. Again, we'd asked Christina to come to talk about a potential ballot initiative that we've kicked around in Boulder County, but we've struggled with for lots of reasons, whether it's geographic or the municipality or where. So we struggled for the data, what's the real need? So we struggled with a lot of things that I think you've really helped clear up at least some pathways for me of what are the important questions to get answered.
Yeah, I know I've drilled this home several times, but this isn't the first time that I've really leaned hard on experts to guide me through a process that I wasn't necessarily well equipped to deal with. And I can't recommend it enough. It's led to success in other initiatives for me as well. I think the way I saw it for Larimer County was that our children and families deserved the best in terms of how we put this proposal together and the best odds of success. And I didn't want to fumble through that. So we've been successful because we hired the right people to lead us through the process.
Super. Thank you for sharing.
Wish us luck, y'all, that our commissioners actually refer. But you'll get our lessons learned in some sort of report or brief regardless, because we want people to learn from what we did.
Yeah. Thank you. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, good luck.
Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. And you all probably have my emails, or you can get it from Matt. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or want any additional support. I'm happy to help.
Okay. Thank you, Christina.
Christina, bye-bye.
All right. Well, thanks for letting me take more time. I know that was probably more